The blood on Dr. Emma Rodriguez Scruggs was still fresh from the emergency surgery when the SEALs burst through the medical tent flaps. "We need a sniper," Sergeant Mitchell barked, his face grim with urgency. "Hostile has our extraction team pinned down, 2,800 meters out. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they're all dead." The other SEALs nodded grimly, already mentally cataloging which of their marksmen was best suited for an impossible shot. None of them looked at Emma. To them, she was just the nurse, the quiet woman who patched up their wounds and handed out painkillers. What they didn't know was that before Dr. Emma Rodriguez had learned to save lives with a scalpel, she had learned to take them with a rifle. And the shot they were calling impossible, she had made harder ones before. Welcome to Silent Heroes Stories. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Forward Operating Base. Chapman sat like a concrete fortress in the heart of Afghanistan's Paktia province, surrounded by mountains that held both beauty and death in equal measure. The base buzzed with the constant activity of America's finest warriors, SEALs, Rangers, and Special Forces operators, who had been fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda for months in some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. In the center of this masculine battlefield sat a small medical facility, clean and sterile, where Dr. Emma Rodriguez had spent the last 18 months saving the lives of men who barely acknowledged her existence beyond her medical skills. At 31, Emma was a lieutenant in the United States Navy, a trauma surgeon who had graduated at the top of her class from Johns Hopkins before volunteering for deployment to one of the most dangerous forward operating bases in Afghanistan. The SEALs respected her medical abilities. She had saved too many of their friends for them not to. But respect in the medical tent didn't translate to respect as a warrior. To them, she was Doc Rodriguez, the stunning blonde woman who worked 18-hour days, never complained, and somehow managed to keep everyone alive despite the constant stream of wounded warriors flowing through her doors. What they saw was a breathtakingly beautiful woman, nearly 5'8", with platinum blonde hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail and piercing blue eyes that had seen more trauma in 18 months than most doctors see in a lifetime. Her hands, when they weren't covered in surgical gloves, were elegant and precise. Surgeons' hands, they thought. Hands made for saving lives, not taking them. They saw her dedication to her patients, the way she would work through the night to save a wounded soldier, the compassion in her voice when she delivered bad news to young men far from home. They saw the family photos she kept on her small desk, images from her childhood in California, and the medical textbooks she read during her few hours of downtime. What they didn't see were the other photos hidden in a locked drawer. Graduation photos from the Navy's Advanced Marksmanship Training Program, commendation letters with heavily redacted sections, and a small metal pin that had no official meaning, but was recognized by a very select group of individuals within the special operations community. They didn't notice the way Emma's blue eyes automatically tracked movement outside the medical tent, or how she unconsciously calculated distances and wind patterns during quiet moments. They missed the subtle calluses on her fingertips that came from thousands of hours of trigger time, or the way she could identify the sound of different weapons by their acoustic signatures alone. Most importantly, they never wondered why a trauma surgeon who looked like a fashion model would volunteer for deployment to one of the most dangerous bases in Afghanistan, or why someone with her medical credentials would request assignment to a forward operating base instead of a comfortable hospital ship or stateside naval medical center. Emma's days at FOB Chapman followed a predictable pattern that masked an extraordinary reality. She would wake at 0500 hours, 30 minutes before the first call to prayer echoed across the Afghan landscape, and spend those quiet moments maintaining equipment that had nothing to do with medicine. Hidden beneath a false bottom in her footlocker was a disassembled M40A6 sniper rifle, broken down into components that could pass for medical equipment to anyone not trained to recognize them. Each morning, she would quickly inspect and clean each piece with the same precision she brought to surgical instruments, her manicured fingers moving with muscle memory developed over years of training. The rifle was officially listed as medical equipment replacement parts on the supply manifests, a fiction that was possible only because of her dual assignment, something the SEALs knew nothing about. To them, she was simply Navy medical personnel. They had no idea that she also carried a designation as a medical reconnaissance specialist, a program so classified that even her commanding officer at Chapman didn't have full access to her personnel file. After her equipment maintenance, Emma would transition seamlessly into her medical duties. She would check on patients from the previous day's casualties, review surgical schedules, and prepare for whatever trauma the day might bring. Her work was exemplary. Her patient survival rate was the highest of any forward operating base in Afghanistan, and her surgical skills had earned praise from visiting medical inspectors. But during quiet moments between medical emergencies, Emma would position herself where she could observe the base's surroundings through the tent openings. Her piercing blue eyes would track the ridgelines that surrounded Chapman, noting changes in vegetation, unusual movements, or anything that might indicate hostile activity. She was gathering intelligence, though the SEALs assumed she was simply taking breaks from her medical duties. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days saving the lives of warriors who saw her as a beautiful non-combatant medical personnel, while simultaneously conducting surveillance activities that helped keep those same warriors alive. Her medical tent was positioned specifically to provide optimal observation of the base's vulnerable approaches, not by accident, but by careful design that the base command had implemented without explaining to the other personnel. Emma had learned to live in this dual reality. During the day, she was Dr. Rodriguez, the compassionate healer who never hesitated to risk her own safety to save a wounded soldier. But during the long Afghan nights, when the base was on high alert and hostile activity increased, she became something else entirely. She became Overwatch 7, a designation known only to a handful of intelligence officers and special operations commanders. The SEALs had no idea that their stunning medical officer was also providing long-range reconnaissance and, when necessary, precision fire support for operations beyond the wire. They assumed the occasional sound of distant rifle fire was coming from perimeter security or patrol activities. They never suspected that some of those precisely placed shots were coming from their own medical tent. The explosion shook forward operating base Chapman at 13:42 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, the sound rolling across the desert like thunder as black smoke rose from beyond the perimeter. Emma looked up from the IV she was adjusting on a wounded Marine, her medical training immediately prioritizing the patient in front of her, while her tactical training began processing the implications of what she had just heard. IED strike, 3 clicks northwest, came the radio call from the operations center. Convoy Alpha is requesting immediate medical evacuation. Multiple casualties, unknown status. Emma's hands continued their medical work without pause, but her mind was already shifting into combat mode. 3 kilometers northwest put the convoy in the Tangi Valley, a notorious ambush site where the Taliban had been increasingly active. If they had struck a convoy there, it wasn't just an opportunistic attack. It was part of a larger coordinated operation. "Doc, we're going to need you ready for multiple trauma cases," Sergeant Mitchell called out as he rushed past the medical tent. Convoys carrying 8 personnel, and initial reports suggest at least 5 casualties. Emma nodded, already moving to prepare her surgical area for mass casualty treatment. But even as she worked, part of her attention was focused on the radio chatter coming from the operations center. The convoy was pinned down. The Taliban hadn't just struck and withdrawn. They were maintaining contact, which meant they had positioned Overwatch to prevent rescue operations. 20 minutes later, the first helicopter arrived with the wounded. Emma threw herself into the work she knew best: triaging casualties, stopping bleeding, saving lives. A young soldier with shrapnel wounds to his chest and abdomen required immediate surgery, and Emma worked with focused intensity to repair the damage that improvised explosive devices and small arms fire had inflicted on someone barely old enough to vote. It was during this surgery, her hands deep inside the soldier's abdominal cavity, that Sergeant Mitchell burst through the tent flaps with the news that would change everything. "We need a sniper," he barked, his face grim with urgency. "Hostile has our extraction team pinned down, 2,800 meters out. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they're all dead." The other SEALs nodded grimly, already mentally cataloging which of their marksmen was best suited for an impossible shot. None of them looked at Emma. To them, she was just the nurse, the stunning blonde who saved their lives but had nothing to do with taking lives. The SEALs stood frozen as Emma Rodriguez opened her footlocker and began assembling what was clearly not medical equipment. Her movements were quick and efficient, the movements of someone who had performed this assembly hundreds of times. Within 90 seconds, a complete M40A6 sniper rifle system lay across her bunk, along with specialized ammunition that definitely wasn't part of any medical supply order. "Doc, what the hell?" Sergeant Mitchell started. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Emma corrected, checking the rifle's action with movements that were purely military. "And before you ask, yes, I'm qualified on this system." She pulled out a small leather folder and handed it to Mitchell. Inside were certifications, training records, and commendation letters that painted a very different picture of the woman they had known only as their medical officer. Advanced Marksmanship Training Program, Naval Special Warfare Training Certificates, a recommendation letter for the Naval Special Operations Command that was dated just 2 years earlier. "You're a sniper," Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a trauma surgeon who happens to be qualified as a designated marksman," Emma replied, already moving toward the tent exit with her rifle. "And right now, I'm the only person on this base who can make a 2,800-meter shot in these conditions." The SEALs followed her outside, their minds struggling to reconcile the stunning doctor they had known with the tactical operator who was now setting up a shooting position on the raised platform behind the medical facility. Emma's movements were completely professional, checking wind indicators, calculating angles, adjusting her rifle scope with micro-precision. "How long have you been qualified?" Mitchell asked. 12 years, Emma replied, not looking up from her scope adjustments. "I was a designated marksman before I was a doctor. The Navy sent me to medical school as part of a special program to develop medical personnel who could also provide tactical support in forward-deployed environments." The concept was beginning to make sense to the SEALs. A medical officer who could also provide precision fire support would be invaluable in exactly these types of situations. Someone who could save lives during the day and take them when necessary at night. "What's your longest confirmed kill?" asked Petty Officer Adams, the question automatic among snipers. 3,247 meters, Emma replied calmly, making final adjustments to her scope. "Somalia, 2019. Similar conditions to today, slightly better wind." The SEALs exchanged glances. A 3,200-meter shot would put Emma among the top long-range marksmen in the world. It also explained why someone with her medical credentials would volunteer for deployment to a forward operating base. At 2,847 meters, the Taliban sniper was little more than a shadow against the rocky outcropping of the Afghan ridge. Through Emma's high-powered scope, she could see only occasional glimpses of movement, a brief exposure of an elbow here, the flash of a muzzle blast there. Her target wasn't cooperating by presenting a clear shot, which meant she would have to create her opportunity. Emma's breathing had slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm that snipers learn to master. Each breath was deliberate, each heartbeat calculated into her shot timing. Around her, the SEALs maintained absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Target is engaging our people again," came the radio update from the pinned extraction team. "2 more minutes, maybe 3, before we have to move to compromised position." Emma made a final adjustment to her scope's elevation. At this distance, the bullet would travel for nearly 4 seconds before reaching its target, during which time gravity would pull the projectile down approximately 37 feet. Wind drift would push it sideways by an additional 18 inches. Temperature and air density would affect the bullet's ballistic coefficient. Even the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, would influence the bullet's path over such an extreme distance. But Emma had calculated for all of these factors. More importantly, she had learned to account for variables that couldn't be calculated. The subtle changes in wind patterns that occurred in mountainous terrain, the way heat shimmer affected visual perception at long range, the split-second timing required to engage a target who was only occasionally visible. Through her scope, she watched the hostile position and began to read the pattern of the Taliban sniper's movements. He would expose himself briefly to engage the extraction team, then withdraw to a covered position for approximately 45 seconds before engaging again. During his brief exposures, only a small portion of his torso was visible, an area roughly the size of a dinner plate at a distance of nearly 3 kilometers. "Target movement," Emma whispered, more to herself than to the SEALs around her. Through her scope, she could see the hostile sniper shifting position, preparing for another engagement against the trapped Americans. This was her moment. Emma's breathing stopped at the natural respiratory pause, her trigger finger applying steady pressure with the consistency that had been drilled into her through thousands of practice shots. Her entire world narrowed to the intersection of crosshairs and target, to the precise moment when all variables aligned. The shot broke with a sound that was both sharp and hollow, the crack of the rifle's report echoing across the desert as the bullet began its 4-second journey across nearly 3 kilometers of hostile territory. Emma maintained her sight picture, following through with textbook precision, while the bullet traveled downrange at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. 4 seconds later, the radio crackled with sudden activity from the extraction team. "Movement has stopped on the ridge. Hostile sniper position is silent." Emma continued to observe through her scope. At this distance, she couldn't see the impact of her bullet, but she could see that the pattern of muzzle flashes from the hostile position had completely ceased. "Overwatch 6, this is ground team," came the radio call. "Hostile sniper position appears to be neutralized. We're moving to extract now." Word of the 2,847-meter shot spread through forward operating base Chapman with the speed that only military communities can achieve. By evening, every person on the base had heard some version of the story about their medical officer making an impossible shot to save a trapped extraction team. But Emma Rodriguez had made it clear that she preferred not to discuss the incident, and she certainly didn't want special treatment because of it. She spent the rest of that day focused entirely on her medical duties, monitoring her surgical patient and treating 2 additional wounded soldiers who were brought in during the afternoon. To anyone watching her work, she seemed completely unchanged by the morning's events. Her hands were as steady as ever, her bedside manner as compassionate, her medical decision-making as precise. But the SEALs were looking at her differently now. When they spoke to her, there was a new note of respect in their voices, not just the respect they had always shown for her medical skills, but the deeper respect that warriors show for other warriors. They had questions, of course, but Emma deflected most of them with gentle humor and a firm insistence that her primary job was medical care. "How long have you been doing both?" Sergeant Mitchell asked during a quiet moment when he came in for a routine examination of a minor shrapnel wound. "The dual assignment?" "About 4 years," Emma replied, checking his wound for signs of infection. "The Navy has a small program for medical personnel who can also provide tactical support. It's not something they advertise, for obvious reasons." But you were a sniper before you were a doctor. Emma nodded. I enlisted right out of high school, showed aptitude for marksmanship, got selected for advanced training, but I also scored high on the medical aptitude tests, so the Navy offered me a deal. They'd send me to medical school if I agreed to serve in a dual capacity afterward. Best of both worlds, Mitchell observed. Sometimes, Emma agreed. Though it can be complicated, living two different roles. Medical personnel are supposed to be non-combatants under the Geneva Convention, but in reality, forward operating bases need people who can fill multiple roles. What Emma didn't mention was the psychological complexity of her dual assignment. She spent most of her time saving lives, using all of her skills and training to heal wounded warriors and send them back to their families. But when the tactical situation required it, she transitioned seamlessly into a role that involved taking lives with the same precision she brought to surgery. The mental compartmentalization required to function effectively in both roles had taken years to develop. She had learned to think of her sniper skills not as a contradiction to her medical training, but as another tool for protecting the people she was sworn to serve. Every hostile she eliminated was a threat that could no longer harm American service members or Afghan civilians. That evening, as Emma was completing her daily medical reports, Colonel Barnes, the base commander, appeared at her tent. Barnes was a career infantry officer who had been briefed on Emma's dual assignment when she was first assigned to Chapman, but he had never seen her tactical capabilities demonstrated so dramatically. Dr. Rodriguez, he said formally, I wanted to personally thank you for your actions today. The extraction team reports that they would have been completely overrun without your intervention. I was doing my job, sir, Emma replied. Both parts of it. 3 weeks after the 2,847-meter shot, a delegation arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman that caused considerable excitement among the personnel. The group included a Rear Admiral from Naval Special Operations Command, a colonel from Marine Corps Special Operations, and several individuals in civilian clothes whose exact affiliations were unclear, but whose presence suggested very high-level interest in recent events. Emma was conducting a routine medical examination when Sergeant Mitchell informed her that she was requested in the base commander's office immediately. She finished with her patient, washed her hands with the same careful precision she brought to everything she did, and walked across the base wondering what kind of bureaucratic requirements her dual assignment had triggered now. The meeting was unlike anything she had experienced in her military career. The Rear Admiral, a man named Patterson, who had obviously been briefed extensively on her background, got straight to the point. Dr. Rodriguez, your actions 3 weeks ago have created a considerable stir in certain circles, he began. The 2,847-meter confirmed kill under combat conditions represents some of the finest marksmanship we've ever documented. But more importantly, the fact that you immediately transitioned back to life-saving medical work demonstrates exactly the kind of versatility we need in modern special operations. Emma listened without comment, understanding that this was leading somewhere significant. We'd like to offer you a position developing training programs for medical personnel who can provide tactical support in special operations environments, Patterson continued. You'd be based at Coronado, working directly with SEAL teams and other special operations units to create standardized training for medical tactical personnel. The offer was attractive. It would mean returning to the United States, working in a training environment rather than a combat zone, and using her experience to develop programs that could save American lives in future conflicts. But it would also mean leaving the direct patient care that had always been the foundation of her identity as a medical professional. Sir, may I ask about patient care responsibilities in this new role? You'd be working primarily in a training and development capacity, Patterson replied. Limited direct patient contact, but you'd be training the next generation of medical personnel who would be saving lives in forward environments. Emma nodded, understanding the trade-off. And the tactical aspects? You'd be developing marksmanship and tactical training programs, but not as a primary combatant role. more as an instructor and program developer. The colonel from Marine Corps Special Operations leaned forward. Dr. Rodriguez, what you've proven is that the traditional separation between medical and combat roles doesn't have to exist. With proper training and the right personnel, we can have medical professionals who can also provide tactical support when situations require it. But we need people like you to develop those training programs, one of the civilian representatives added. People who have actually performed in both roles under combat conditions. Emma realized that they were offering her a chance to influence how the military would train medical and tactical personnel for years to come. Her experience at Forward Operating Base Chapman would become the foundation for programs that could potentially save hundreds of American lives in future conflicts. When would you need an answer, sir? We'd like to begin program development within the next 6 months, Patterson replied. But we understand this is a significant career decision. Take whatever time you need. 6 months later, Dr. Emma Rodriguez stood in a state-of-the-art training facility at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, watching as a group of Navy medical personnel practiced transitioning from medical procedures to tactical marksmanship. The program she had developed, officially called Integrated Medical Tactical Training, had become a model for how the military could prepare medical professionals for the complex realities of modern warfare. The students in front of her were learning skills that Emma had acquired through years of separate training programs and combat experience. They were practicing the mental compartmentalization required to save a life with surgery, then transition to taking a life with precision shooting, then return immediately to medical care without psychological disruption. The key, Emma told her students, is understanding that both roles serve the same ultimate purpose: protecting American service members and completing the mission. Whether you're stopping bleeding or stopping threats, you're using your skills to bring everyone home alive. The training program had attracted attention from throughout the Special Operations community. Representatives from Army Special Forces, Air Force Special Operations, and even allied nations had visited to observe the training methods Emma had developed. The program's success rate was extraordinary. Medical personnel who completed the integrated training showed improved performance in both medical and tactical roles. But for Emma, the most satisfying aspect of the program was watching her students develop the confidence that came from being fully prepared for the realities they would face in forward-deployed environments. These medical professionals would never be surprised by a tactical situation the way the SEALs at Chapman had been surprised by her capabilities. During a break in training, Emma received a call from Sergeant Mitchell, who was now stationed at a different forward operating base, but had stayed in touch since their time together at Chapman. "Doc, thought you'd want to know," Mitchell said. "We've got 2 of your program graduates here with us now, medical personnel who can actually shoot. It's made a huge difference in how we approach operations in contested areas." "How are they performing?" Emma asked. "Outstanding. They've got the confidence to operate in tactical environments, and when we need precision fire support, they can provide it. But they're still primarily medical personnel. They're still saving lives every day." That was exactly what Emma had hoped to achieve. Medical professionals who could function effectively in combat environments without losing their primary identity as healers. People who could fill multiple roles when necessary, but who remained fundamentally committed to the preservation of life. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from her family in California. Her parents, who had never fully understood her decision to join the military, had gradually come to understand and support her career choices. The photo was from her younger sister's medical school graduation, the sister who had been inspired by Emma's example to pursue medicine herself, though in a more traditional civilian context. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that her combination of healing and fighting had inspired her sister to focus entirely on healing. But that was appropriate. Not everyone needed to serve in both roles. The military needed people who could fill multiple functions when circumstances required it, but it also needed people who could focus entirely on their primary specialties. As evening approached and the training day ended, Emma walked along the beach near the naval base, thinking about the path that had brought her to this point. She had started as a young woman looking for opportunities, had become a warrior, then a healer, then something that combined both roles. Now she was a teacher, passing on knowledge that could help save American lives in future conflicts. 2 years after the 2,847-meter shot that had defined her career, Dr. Emma Rodriguez stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing her dress blue naval uniform with ribbons that told the story of someone who had served with extraordinary distinction. The ceremony that day would officially recognize her contributions to military medicine and tactical operations. But for Emma, the real recognition had already come from the hundreds of medical personnel she had trained and the lives they had saved in combat zones around the world. The Secretary of the Navy stepped forward to read the citation for the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The language was necessarily vague. Operational security requirements meant that many details of Emma's service would remain classified, but the essence of her achievement was clear. For extraordinary heroism while serving as medical officer and designated marksman at Forward Operating Base Chapman, Afghanistan. Dr. Rodriguez consistently demonstrated exceptional courage and skill in dual roles, providing life-saving medical care while also neutralizing hostile threats that endangered American personnel. Her actions during a critical incident in which she eliminated a hostile sniper at extreme range, while simultaneously managing multiple trauma patients, exemplify the highest traditions of naval service. As the medal was pinned to her uniform, Emma thought about all the people who had contributed to this moment. The drill instructors who had taught her to shoot, the medical school professors who had taught her to heal, the SEALs at Chapman who had learned to see her as both doctor and warrior, the students she now trained who would carry these skills forward into future conflicts. But mostly, she thought about the extraction team crew members who were alive, because she had been able to make an impossible shot when it mattered most. That was what military service meant to her, being prepared to do whatever was necessary to bring fellow Americans home safely. After the ceremony, Emma was approached by a young naval officer, a recent medical school graduate who was about to begin the Integrated Medical Tactical Training Program. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say that your program is the reason I chose naval medicine," the young officer said. "I want to serve where I can make the biggest difference, and you've shown that medical personnel can contribute to the mission in ways that go beyond traditional roles." Emma smiled, recognizing something of her younger self in the officer's enthusiasm. "What's your background, Lieutenant?" "I grew up in Montana, ma'am. Learned to shoot hunting with my father, but always wanted to be a doctor. When I learned about your program, I realized I could do both." "The most important thing to remember," Emma said, "is that both skills serve the same purpose. Whether you're healing or protecting, you're serving something larger than yourself. Don't ever lose sight of that." What they didn't know about Dr. Emma Rodriguez could have filled a classified file, but in the end, what mattered wasn't what was hidden in that file. What mattered was what happened when extraordinary skills met extraordinary circumstances, when someone who had prepared for the unthinkable was called upon to do the impossible. The SEALs, who had dismissed her as just a nurse, learned that there was no such thing as just anything in military service. The stunning blonde woman who saved their lives every day had also been prepared to protect those lives in ways they had never imagined. Emma's story became part of military folklore, but she had insisted that it not end with individual heroism. Instead, it became a teaching tool, a reminder that extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, and that assumptions about what people can or cannot do are frequently wrong. In a world that often judges by appearances, Dr. Emma Rodriguez proved that beauty and lethality could coexist, that the most remarkable people are often the ones who serve in silence, and that sometimes the person saving your life might also be the one willing to take a life to protect yours.